Hi everybody, my name is Shelby. I'm going to be doing my presentation today on the cult culture of the 90s in America. So some of you might be old enough to remember what it was like living in the 90s in America. Some of you may not. I'm sure you've heard stories or music from the 90s. It's really a nostalgic time for people that remember it because it's considered to be like a very peaceful, stable, good decade in America. There was a war at the very beginning of the decade from 1990 to 1991, the Gulf War. However, it was so short-lived that it didn't really make a big impact on the 90s. Bill Clinton was in office most of the 90s. From 1993 until 2001, he was in office, following after Bush, and the economy was doing really well in the 90s. It was booming. Unemployment rates were on the decline. It was doing well. Totally unrelatable to now. Religion, most Americans in the 1990s were considered Christian. There's a little over 70% who were Christian. However, if you really think about it and Americans' origins, how it is built off of immigration, and it did originally belong to native tribes before being seized by coloners, you can see how now and in the 90s and even before the 90s, there's a big melting pot effect in America, which is the blending of different cultures in an area. And you can see it even with religion. Yeah, a majority of Americans practice Christianity. However, there was still many other religions being practiced in the 90s of different cultures, some of which you may never even heard of. Language as well is a good point. There's over 300 languages spoken in America. That's a lot of languages. Yeah, English is our official, most popular language, but 300 different languages shows just how many different cultures are within the culture, which are within the cult culture, essentially. And speaking of language too, the medium or channel to communicate in the 1990s was totally different than what it is now. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. You couldn't just sit and text your friend whenever you wanted to talk or whatever you had to say to them. It was a lot slower, less reliable medium or channel to communicate. So they had things like pagers and beepers, which were used. Telephones were used. AOL was really popular in the 90s. Although it did come out in 1985, it was still a very trendy thing in the 90s. Speaking of which, there was also slang that are specific to the 90s, whereas, English was still the language. You could still understand what someone in the 90s was saying. There were specific words, for example, as if, or you to bomb, or fly, that was specific to that cult culture to understand. And they used the semantic rules as well, because there was a consensus that, for example, fly meant cool. So if I said, your jacket's fly, you would know I meant, okay, your jacket's cool, instead of us sitting there trying to understand what it is I just said and what it is fly means, or what is it, so semantic rules were used with that as well. And with that being said, there were a lot of cultural events that happen in America that have been happening for decades and still happen. Things like 4th of July, Thanksgiving, which we just had. Those are things that happen in America, but specific to the cult culture of the 90s are events like one that stood out to me a lot was the O.J. Simpson broadcasting in 94. It stood out to me because it's, the whole nation was watching this event and seeing O.J. Simpson on the LA freeway with a trail of police behind him. And it really changed and sent a shockwave through the nation that most people could relate to of I thought this guy was a Hall of Famer, a good guy, and he's totally not. And so it really, I feel a lot of people of the 90s, if they remember it, were on a similar emotional page that day. So that stood out to me a lot. The pop culture of the 90s as well was very impactful. They had grunge, rap music that came to the scene. Those were really popular. They also had other innovations in technology was on the rise, so you started to see things like Game Boys, Tamagotchis. I don't know if you remember the game MASH. It would be MASH acronyms, and it would be a fun little game that was popular in the 90s as well. But there was a lot of innovation, a lot of change in the 90s that happened. The progress for things like race and gender equality continued to grow and evolve in the 90s, although it did start in decades previous to the 90s and still is really seen today being fought for, you know, with like Black Lives Matter and everything like that. But in the 90s, there was still a progression and a move towards the right direction. And nonetheless, the 90s was an era of time that really changed America's culture as a whole. And it was a really fascinating and peaceful culture to be a part of. Thank you.